Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Author series. My name is Denise and I'm the Adult Services Manager for the library system. Tonight's moderator is Rachel Odell. She is the president of the GGRA, Greater Gwinnett Reentry Alliance. This alliance works to build a bridge between a formerly incarcerated person's reentry and their successful reintegration into society. We're very honored to have her with us tonight. And the author is Miss Victoria Law. She is the author of Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, the co-author of Resistance Behind Bars, tonight's featured book, Prisons Make Us Safer, and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Wired, Bloomsburg Business Week. She is the founder of Books Through Bars, and she edited the book Tenacious, Art and Writing by Women in Prison. Thank you for attending this evening, and we turn the program over to our moderator, Rachel Odell.
Thank you. I was very honored to be asked by Denise, whenever it was, a month or two ago, to read this book and to host this webinar and to interview you, Victoria, and I got a free book out of it, so that was great. I'll show everyone the cover, and we've posted this on our social media over the last couple of weeks as we've been asking people to sign up to come and watch this talk. And so I enjoyed reading it. I was very surprised by some of what I read in there, and I've shared that with some other folks that I've been in other various meetings with over the last few weeks. But I wanted to ask you, Victoria, because I saw, and of course Denise just now said in this introduction that you've written a few other books. Tell us your life story. Tell us how you came to kind of focus on this area in the field. I mean, what is your degree in? What is your kind of background of your job? And then what brought you into this kind of focus?
Thanks, Rachel. I'm so glad to be in conversation with you, and even if it is over Zoom and not in person. So I came into this work kind of haphazardly when I was in high school. So I grew up in New York City. I live in New York City now. Mm-hmm. New York City, probably like much of the country when I was growing up, had a system of schooling where you went to your zone school. So where you lived dictated where you went to school. But the way zoning worked in New York was a little cockamamie. So you wouldn't necessarily be zoned to the school that was closest to you. You might be zoned for a school that was several subway stops away. Mm. And the school that I was zoned for, unbeknownst to me and my family, was a school that was vastly under-resourced, was mostly Black, brown, and immigrant families, was vastly overcrowded, did not have the types of extracurricular activities or other types of activities and programs to help students. And for people who either had money to send their children to private school or had some sort of way to borrow somebody else's address to send their children to a better school, they would do that. So basically what you ended up with were children or teenagers whose parents didn't have that kind of wherewithal. And at the time, this was in the 1990s, it was the perfect recruiting ground for gangs. And so if viewers think about all of the things that we know about teenagers, including our own experiences as teenagers, where we don't have put a lot of forethought into some of our actions. For many of my friends, when they were approached by gang recruiters and asked, do you want to make a couple of $100s every night? Or do you want to just stay in school and, not really see much of a future for yourself?
Boring.
They chose to join gangs, and one by one and two by two, they dropped out of school. They got arrested for gang-related activity. And in New York, we have an island, an entire island that is a jail called Rikers Island. If you ever fly into New York in LaGuardia, it's right next to LaGuardia Airport. If you're seated on a certain side of the plane, you can look out and you actually see the jail as you're flying in and out. And so my friends were sent to Rikers Island, and I started trying to figure out what this thing was that suddenly was in my life: jails, prisons, and incarceration. I started visiting them at Rikers Island. Once a week, I would take the bus from Queens to Rikers Island. There was a special bus that goes there. And for viewers who have never been in a jail or prison visit, there's not a lot to do while you're waiting for that visit. You just sit and you wait. It's not like waiting at the doctor's office or the dentist's office where you can have your phone or you can have a book or there's a TV that shows you some TV show to keep you occupied. You are literally told to check all your belongings in, and then you just sit in a waiting room and you wait, you wait, and you wait, and you wait for your hour-long visit. And everybody else is waiting alongside you. And it was mostly women. It was mostly Black, brown, and immigrant women. And being totally bored, we just started talking, and people would ask, who are you? Who are you here to see? What are they in for? And again, I heard women tell me that they were there to see their brother or their husband or their boyfriend or their son. And everybody who was locked up at Rikers was there for things like violating parole, violating probation, drug use or drug possession, petty theft, robbery. But these were all things that pointed to lack of resources and lack of opportunity, not necessarily being a Jeffrey Dahmer or, like some sort of mass murderer. And at the same time, I started reading about prisons because I really just wanted to know what this thing was that suddenly had entered my life and taken away so many of my friends. And I started going to libraries and independent bookstores and looking specifically for books about prison. Mm-hmm. And everything that I read, the ways in which people of color are disproportionately criminalized, they are disproportionately incarcerated, they often come from neighborhoods that have been under-resourced, they're low income, they don't have a lot of other programs or opportunities. Everything that I read correlated with what I saw week after week at Rikers Island. So fast forward a few years later, I go to Brooklyn College. I'm not thinking very much about prisons as like a career path or anything else, but it is still part of my life because I have childhood friends who have been locked up. Mm-hmm. And I decided to do a research paper on what's happening inside prisons post 1970s. What happens when the war on drugs happens? What happens when mass incarceration really starts to amp up? What happens when there are no longer all of these civil rights and Black liberation and other liberation movements doing support for people inside? Mm-hmm. And what are people inside doing about these conditions? Are they, we're not hearing about prison riots or prison hunger strikes or people trying to form prison unions. So what are they doing? And at the end of the semester, I saw that everything I had, with maybe the exception of one instance, was about men. Mm-hmm. And so I asked myself, what are women doing? Because at the time there were 90,000 something women in jails and prisons. Now we have, 220,000 women in jails and prisons. So this is from like 1999 to 2021, that's been like a huge dramatic jump. But even with 90,000 something women behind bars, I thought they can't all be sitting on their hands, twiddling their thumbs, passively accepting terrible medical care, violence, being torn away from their families. So what are they doing? Mm. And so I started looking into what was happening inside women's prisons. And what I learned was that women in prison have a different set of priorities than men in prison oftentimes. Oftentimes they're the primary caregivers of their children when they're locked up. So they are trying to parent from behind bars. They are more likely to have their children end up in foster care because either they are single parents when they were arrested, or their partner says, I can't, I did not sign up to raise all these kids, or their partner was arrested alongside of them. Mm-hmm. They often come from households which might have been abusive or not safe, and they don't want their children to go and be placed in the care of people who had hurt them in the past. So then they have to navigate a whole other set of complexities while they're in prison that fathers in prison often don't have to navigate. And so when you look at the different sets of priorities, you look at what they're doing that might be different than what men in prison are doing. And that includes helping each other with legal paperwork to keep custody of their children, helping each other navigate the foster care system, forming support groups for battered women and people who have suffered abuse. And that was what really sparked my attention, because I thought, why is nobody writing about these things? You know, at the time, this was the early 2000s, there was not that much attention being paid to prison issues, and there was even less attention being paid to issues affecting women in prison. So I thought, well, somebody needs to tell these stories, because some of the experiences that they're having are atrocious and appalling, and some of their actions are actually pretty inspiring, considering that they are in prison, being told what to do, when to do it, when to get up, when to go to sleep, where they can go, whether or not they can have, you know, paper and pen or a phone call or anything else. So to have women inside organizing to say, fight for a law that would allow them to keep in contact with their children is, you know, seems pretty amazing and astounding. And again, I was thinking somebody needed to write about this. So this is how I got into writing about prisons, was hearing these stories and not seeing them reflected anywhere where other people would be able to access them, to read about them, or to just learn about them.
So is your primary job being a writer, or do you do other activist work? I mean, what is your work that you do other than just the writing in this area?
Yeah. So my primary focus is writing these days. So I am a freelance journalist. I write about prisons. I write largely about women in prison, but I also write about men in prison, transgender people in prison, and I write books. When I was in college, I started Books Through Bars in New York City, which is a program that sends free books to people in prison nationwide. And so people write in, and they actually just write, you know, pen and paper letters to say, "Dear Books Through Bars, I am in prison. I would like a book about X, Y, or Z." And we would do our best to fulfill those requests. Sometimes it was not always a spot on request. Somebody might say, "I really want Malcolm X," which everybody wants. And we might say, "Well, we don't have any Malcolm X on our shelves because it hasn't been donated, but, you know, we have a book on the civil rights movement. We have, you know, like, we have Maya Angelou. We have all of these other books." So it would be a program which basically relied on donations to send books to people inside who might not otherwise have those books. And in some cases, even if they had a library in their prison, either were not able to access it because they were not able to get to the library for a number of reasons, or the library didn't have the types of books we were looking for. I mean, we got maybe 1 out of every 10 or 1 out of every 15 letters were from women in prison, but because women in prison make up about 10% of the prison population. But the number of times we got books saying, "I am pregnant inside. I don't know what to expect. Nobody will tell me what to expect. Like, I don't know what's going on inside my body and with my baby. And there's nothing in the library that will tell me this. Can you please send me a book on pregnancy so at least I know what is happening?" So we really wanted to, like, fill those gaps that the prison was not providing.
Yeah. Now, as I was reading through the book, I had to keep reminding myself. Oh, I just want to remind other people who are watching, if you have a question, you can put it up at any time. I'll start asking questions when I get around to it. I mean, it'll be just in a few minutes after we talk a little bit more here. But if anyone has a question, they don't have to wait until I say, "And now it's time for questions." They can put that in the chat, and it'll just sit there, and I'll call on it. But anyway, as I was reading through each chapter title, I had to remind myself that that these are not chapter titles in and of itself. They are the myths. Like as I would read each one, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, duh, that I totally agree with that," and then I would be like, "Oh wait, she's gonna explain why this is not, the answer, the end all be all." So I'll just read a couple of them. I won't read all 21 of them, but we need prisons to make us safer. That's one. Prisons are places of rehabilitation. People in prison, quote, jump the line, end quote, for life-saving medical care. Incarceration is an effective way to get people into drug treatment.
I love the face you made with that one.
Let's see. I'm trying to kind of look at the ones that like stuck out to me the most, because some of them I was like, yeah, that's totally like that's a straw man or whatever. But then other ones I was like, that seems like a pretty strong argument. How's she gonna kind of straw man that one? Let's see. Prisons keep us safe from murderers and rapists. The system is broken and we simply need some reforms to fix it. Now, that's the one that most made me think, yeah, the system is broken and we simply need some reforms to fix it. But your argument there was, no, the system is working as it should. And then, let's see, I liked the one about Norway. We should make our prisons more like those in Norway. When you went through these and you collected these and decided to make each one a chapter title, were these just things that you had just made notes of over the years you hear people say, or how did you come up with the title for this book and decide to make it about each one of these statements, I guess?
So I actually, the idea of making it about myths actually came from the publisher, who had asked me, would I be interested in writing, a sort of like 101 type of book about prisons. And they had this series of, of books that bust popularly held myths, and they wanted one that looked specifically at prisons. And so what I did, and I thought about it, and I said, yeah, because as people are paying more and more attention, so, like going back to the early 2000s when there wasn't a lot of interest in prison issues, leading to now, there's been more and more interest in prisons. I mean, we see that there are even popular Netflix shows about, fictionalized people in prisons that, go on and on and on for season after season. So people are starting to pay attention.
I thought this person was supposed to get out after 2 years. Why are they still in 5 years later?
Exactly. But also, we see that there's, more organizing around prisons. A few years ago, we saw these divestment campaigns. Divestment is having people withdraw their resources or withdraw their money from private prison companies. So we saw activists pressuring banks to withdraw funds from private prison corporations. So we saw President Obama talk about his clemency initiative. We saw different states starting to roll back punitive drug laws. So we're seeing more interest in prisons overall across the nation, but people's understandings about prisons often relied on some of these myths, like, well, we need prisons to make us safer, so maybe we'll just let out people who committed nonviolent drug offenses and we'll still be safe. Or private prisons are the drivers of mass incarceration. And so if we just close down the private prisons, we will have fixed the problem and then we can all just go home and watch TV. Or even these longstanding myths like people in prison jump the line for medical care. Somebody's going to rob a bank and get, a much needed lung transplant, whereas people on the outside, can't get basic health care type of thing. So these were myths that I heard over and over, and these were the myths that persisted from, the 1990s and early 2000s until today, where I would continue to hear people say these types of things. Like, I think in the early 2000s, nobody was talking about whether or not our prison should be like Norway. But now, as people are trying to figure out what do we do with this giant system that has decimated not only the lives of the people who are inside prisons and jails, but their family members and their loved ones on the outside, and also their communities, because with few exceptions, people are not necessarily all, terrible people that never gave back anything to their communities. You could, still be a loving uncle or somebody that took the kids to the swimming pool or coached Little League or whatever, but also has done this criminalized action or set of actions that landed you behind bars. Now,
reading through these, as far as like the nonviolent offenders, and especially talking about the war on drugs, I'm a libertarian, so that's one of there's always one of their main talking points. We need to stop the war on drugs. But if we did that, and we did this, and we did each of these little things, or even half of these little things, that would overall improve the overall situation. How do we get, I guess, from that point, fill the gap? Where do you, I guess, ideally, if you had your ideal, this is the way criminal justice would look in America if I had my druthers. There's a gap, obviously. If we do all the things we think should be done according to the myths, there's still a gap somewhere. What is that gap, and what is your kind of goal, I suppose?
I mean, I think it depends on what we do when we get rid of all of these things, right? Like, the war on drugs is not only decimated individuals, families, and communities, it also, expanded prison budgets and policing budgets. So suddenly you have police departments that, are ramped up to do anti-drug, vice squad, narcotics narcotics investigations.
They all got a SWAT team now.
Yeah, and everybody gets their very expensive toys, to play with, and and it also swells up budgets for prisons, because all of a sudden you have mass influxes of people who cost a lot of money to incarcerate. I mean, if you think about just that part alone, in some places, it costs, $50,000 a year to incarcerate somebody, and that cost keeps going up. The older that person gets, so if that person is incarcerated for a long period of time, so if they've got a 10, 20, 30, 50-year sentence, they get older and it costs more money, because we're also looking at not just the cost of, putting them in a cell, giving them some minimal food, but you're also looking at the overhead of, you're paying for all the guards that guard them, you're paying for the insurance, you're paying for like the overhead of having this, massive prison. And what could each person in the community do if they just got $50,000 a year to live on? I mean, really, like if, somebody said, Rachel, here you go, here's $50,000,
Your UBI.
Like, good job, good job, you are alive, and, as opposed to saying, you only get, we're willing to spend that money on this, but not on that. What would that look like in terms of, reducing, the amount of crime or things that are labeled as crime right now, if we erase that, but also figured out ways in which we supported people through what they needed. So instead of just saying like, okay, we're just going to dump you back into these communities that have been under-resourced for decades and decades, where you've asked for better schools, you've asked for recreational centers, you've asked for after-school programs for kids or summer youth employment programs as the kids get older, and instead all you got were police that stopped and harassed the kids. All you got were, police, drug deals, and crime. And if you just leave those communities to flounder, then they will just continue to flounder. It's not like that would solve anything. Yeah. But I think that a good first step would be to eliminate these things that are very unnecessary. The war on drugs, like policing, people, for alleged sex work or anything else that, is just not really bothering people. In New York and Arizona, probably in Georgia too, there are either statutes on the book or there are informal policing policies of, say, policing trans people and picking up trans women on the pretext that they must be doing sex work. So, just not doing these things is a good first step. And then also figuring out then, like, how do we intervene in other, instances before something gets to the point where somebody becomes, somebody murders somebody else or somebody rapes somebody else. What we have to remember is that prisons come after the fact, not before, so people don't get picked. Most people do not get picked up on the suspicion that they will try to murder somebody. They get picked up after the fact, if they get picked up at all. I mean, we also have to remember that over 50% of violent crimes don't get reported. And then for homicides, 1/3 of murders in the United States just remain unsolved. So
that's great.
That, 1 out of 3 murders just don't have a resolution. People never know what happened to their loved ones, or they know that their loved one is dead, it might have died in this manner, but they don't have any sense of resolution or closure. So we have a system now that doesn't necessarily work to address much of the violence that happens.
Yeah, as I was reading through it, I agreed with a lot of things, and of course my eyes were open to a lot of things. I participate in a ministry that a woman who's a member of the GGRA, she was incarcerated 10 or now I can't remember if it was 10 or 20. I think it was 10 years ago. For drugs, and she had also a history of being abused, sexual abuse, that whole thing. It kind of led her down this path, and she was arrested and did some time, and then while she was in prison, she had a spiritual awakening. She came to Jesus, literally, and she started this ministry that she now does outside, and she recruits people who she sends the book, the Bible study book, to the women in the prison, as well as their mentor on the outside. And now she's done one for men too, but so we communicate via email with our mentee on the inside, and we go through. But anyway, we do these monthly meetings where we talk as mentors and update on what's going on with our people that we're serving. And as I was reading this book, I had a meeting like last week, and I said, this book has been pretty eye-opening, because some folks were, expressing concern, like, well, my mentee that I work with, like, she hasn't emailed me back, and, they had this issue or that issue with communication. And I was like, things are harder than you might think inside, as far as something might happen. It just throws the whole routine off. Everything goes into lockdown for a week or something. I mean, and then it's lights out. You can't get any communication going or whatever. They also are just battling depression. One of the girls I've been talking to was talking about how she's not in this situation anymore, but she did have a cellmate that, made her nervous. Was like, she was afraid she was going to get beat up or whatever. This person was verbally abusive or whatever. So, but reading through the book, I thought, well, even if we could fix everything, there's never going to be the complete cure, the utopian society where we headed off every crime at the outset because we put in all the community service things, but we can always do better, right? We can always improve. And I feel like over time there's been certain things, I suppose, that have been improved upon, like prison conditions nowadays are probably more sanitary and humane than perhaps they were 150 years ago or 200 years ago. But then other things have gone downhill, as far as, like you say, sort of widening the net, making certain things crimes that maybe don't need to be crimes. I feel like we definitely could do better with, and this is something I've just learned from working with the GGRA, like move and let people get through the system and get out and get on with their lives, man. Like that whole thing, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's that because we expect the government to be a nanny state, they're like, well, we're going to be a nanny state. Then if you come through our system, we're going to keep an eye on you and never let you go. I guess I'm trying to figure out where I want to go with this. But one thing I did think of, as I got to the very end of the book and the transformational justice versus just restorative justice or whatever, transformative justice, it goes back to what you said, even in your telling of your life story, and you've mentioned it a couple of other times, that one of the best ways to, I guess, head people off from that life of crime or help people once they've come out is to have a sense of community, right? Like, and at the most basic level, we have our family, right? People who grow up in a two-parent household, whether they're rich or poor, they're less likely to get into legal trouble. They're more likely to graduate high school and stay out of poverty and all that business. But on a bigger level, bigger than just your family, like are you able to participate in sports? Are you able to participate in a music group, at school? Do you go to church? Do you have some sort of connection to the societal fabric, that makes you feel like you're seen and you're special, and that you see others and you really connect with them? I think that's why my friend Pamela's ministry is really good, because connecting people on the inside with people on the outside, like our goal is to walk with them through this process and help them to be seen. Kind of what's your ideas of some ways to implement the transformational justice, transformative justice type of measures?
Well, I think first of all, we should think of, so transformative justice is this idea that when something happens, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, it could be like a small thing, right? Like you and I have, a disagreement. I shove you, I grab your, like I grab your book or, whatever, and it's like, okay, we would sit down and talk it out as, normal people do. So it's kind of taking that and scaling that up. So when something happens, some sort of harm happens, you actually, sit, and try to work through it. So both the person who was harmed by the action, so say like we get into an argument, and I punch you, and like you're like, this is not okay, but I don't want to call the police on you and have you get arrested and, put through the system. But you also cannot go around punching me or other people because you're, this is just not, acceptable behavior. And it might say like, okay, so, we sit down with other people. So it's not just between me and you, and I say, well, you deserved it. But you could say like, hey, this is not okay. And perhaps your husband is like, now I'm worried anytime Rachel goes out because I'm worried that one of her other friends will assault her, or I'm worried about, her safety now. This is how this has affected, me. And your kids might come and they might say like, this is how this has affected us. We're really afraid for our mommy's safety, like we don't. And so I can see that there's a ripple effect to this. It's not just, I punched you in the heat of the moment. We had an argument. You said this, I said that, and then I might come with people who might be like, oh, like Vicky's had a really hard time because, like maybe a loved one, is ill or something else. And you might say, oh, I can see this, like I can see what led up to this behavior. And then there's, and so then we can figure out what is going on at the root and try to transform that. So transformative justice looks at this, and we can start small. We don't need to start with the like, you murdered my brother and I'm going to do this, but start small. Like, how do we be accountable to each other? Like we do this at, as parents and family members. Hey, you said you would do the dishes. You didn't do them, like holding each other accountable. Like, like how do you hold people accountable? You don't, pick up the phone and say like, I'm going to call the police because, you didn't do the dishes. You said you would do the laundry, you didn't pick up your socks. So, and then scaling that up to say like, hey, like you did something that was harmful or hurtful. How do we address that? And then how do we
there's a necessary,
I'm
sorry, there's a necessary level of braveness that it takes to do that too. Not because we sometimes want to go behind their back and talk about them rather than talk to them. But also when you come to talk to someone, are you seeking reconciliation or are you just seeking to accuse? I mean, and this, what you're even bringing up, I mean, this is even biblical. This is like what Christians call the Matthew 18. This is the Matthew 18 method. When someone is caught in sin and you go to them first, you confront them. And if that doesn't work, you take a few friends and you say, we need to talk about this. And if that doesn't work, then it's bring them before the whole church. But yeah, I think that requires even a level of strength on the part of the victim, but also a willingness to say, my point is not to come in bad faith and just accuse you. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, rather than just, you did this and how could you? It's like, how can we move beyond this and reconcile? And if not reconcile, let's say we were just incompatible or you were just an unsafe person. Like, how can we kind of peacefully make a break here, I suppose?
Yeah. I mean, what we see, so in my book, I look at one program, Common Justice, which is in New York City. It is a restorative justice program. So it doesn't necessarily seek to transform all the conditions, but it seeks to figure out ways in which people can come together and figure out how to address the harm that has happened. How do you hold this person accountable without sending this person, ripping them out of their community and sending them to jail or to prison? So it works with, the program works with 16 to 24-year-olds who are accused of violent crimes. So it's not like, like I stole your book or, like I did drugs. It's like, did I, like I robbed somebody or I stabbed somebody or I shot at somebody or I shot somebody. And what they do is they go to the courts and they monitor the courts and they go and they find people who, like are facing these charges. They talk to the district attorney and then they go and before they even talk to the person who is facing charges, they talk to the victim and they explain what the program is. They say, like we want to do, like we will provide you with victim services as well. So it's not just all about the person who did the harm, but it's like, what do you need? And the person might say, I really need, like somebody to like help me figure out how to get time off from work because I'm so traumatized from, being harmed that I need to do this. I need somebody to help me figure out how to like figure out like all these medical bills I now have because I was assaulted, when I went to the hospital and, I didn't have insurance or, my insurance doesn't cover, all of these things. And now I have these gargantuan copays. I really need to, see a counselor because now I'm really freaked out that I've been attacked. And so it's working with the victims and then saying, so they offer not just this opportunity to confront the person who has harmed you, but also what do you need in order to heal and move on with your life. And most of the time, they told me that like when given this opportunity of going to court and hoping that the courts take this seriously and, like this person is prosecuted, or doing a restorative justice process in which the person who harmed them also has to take accountability for their actions, and has to take steps to make sure that they don't repeat this action. So it's not just I'm sorry, Rachel, that I punched you, but you might say, Vicki, you need to go to anger management. Like you need to go to therapy. Like you need to work out whatever this is, because even though now I understand other things are going on in your life, you can't lash out at people that way. Like, like you need to be proactive in making sure that you never, ever do that again. And so that is kind of what, Common Justice offers. And it's not a short process. It's not 2 weeks. It's not 4 weeks. It can be a year and a half of people working separately. So one set of staff works with the person who was harmed or the victim to be like, what do you need? And also people may not necessarily know what they want to ask of the person who harmed them because they're so caught in the moment of, you hurt me, I want to hurt you back. But they might say later on, this is what I want. I want no other, person to go through what I went through. I want you not to harm anybody else. Mothers have said, I really, at first wanted this person to burn in hell. I wanted them to like burn in boiling oil. I wanted to, I really wanted them to suffer. Yeah. And then they said, but you know what? When they thought about it more, they said, I don't want that person to go to prison for X amount of years and come out exactly the same, and for any other mother to be, to end up in my situation, because that person has not changed. That person has not taken accountability. because prisons just put people
Yeah.
in cells or in dormitories, and it's up to that person to want to change. Like the woman that does the ministry, it's not up, but there's nothing that requires
Yeah,
them
they apply to go through that program, you
yeah,
know.
but there's nothing that pushes them and says you must go to the ministry, and accept responsibility for your actions. You could do every single day of your 10-year sentence, 15-year sentence, and minimize and dismiss the harm that you have caused. And then, so for many victims, they say, well, if you're giving me a choice that's do nothing, go to the criminal court system, or do restorative justice, the majority in New York who are given that third option say, you know what, I want to do this because I want closure. And I want this person never to hurt me, my loved ones, or anybody else ever again.
I'm going to go through a few of the questions. I'll start at the bottom and go to the top because the top question is good for the end. So let's see. One of the viewers is interested in what is the average cost of a prisoner and where can that data be found? You mentioned something like $50,000 or so a year. Where did you get that? Is that nationwide or what's a nationwide figure?
No, it actually varies gigantically from state to state. I believe like Oklahoma, it's $27,000 per person, but then California, something is more than 50,000. I forget if it's 60 or 70,000.
Cost of living overall would affect that, I would think.
I don't know if it's cost of living or, maybe it's the amount that they, like have to pay for everything, like including, like Oklahoma does not have a very robust guards union and they don't pay their guards a lot, which is why they don't have guards. Many times they have staffing shortages. California has a very powerful correctional officers union, so starting salary is a lot higher. So what I did, for there are two ways to do it. There's a group called the Prison Policy Initiative, which tracks different aspects of prisons, and they often publish things about how much it costs to incarcerate a person, and they break those numbers down. If you're interested in specific states, you can go to that state's Department of Corrections website. So you type in, say, Georgia plus Department of Corrections, and they have to submit annual reports that say, this is how much, we spent, this is how much it costs to incarcerate a person. And so you can find out how much it costs to incarcerate a person in the state prison system. For counties, it might be a little trickier, but you could actually get that, but it's supposed to be public data because it is your tax dollars that are going towards funding this. You can see how much. You can go to their website and, find out how much they've spent, in the past year. I mean, one appalling thing, that I think most people would be appalled by is that in Atlanta, there is a giant, an 11 or 17-story jail called the Atlanta City Detention Center, which was built in the 1990s, basically to sweep homeless people off the streets in time for the Olympics, and is only used for incarcerating people who violate city ordinances. So that's drinking a beer on the corner. Like you just go to the store and you buy a beer and you don't go home and drink it. You drink it on the street corner, peeing in public, being homeless, walking on the roadway, which in Atlanta, if you don't have a car, sometimes the sidewalks stop and you're just in the middle of the road. And
is that the one they just, I feel like they just closed one a year or two ago.
They were supposed to close it. And I think now there are something there's maybe less than 12 people there per night, but you still have this gigantic jail that still costs.
They're trying to transition it to something. They're trying to transition it to something.
Yes. But I mean, so if you think about the cost of that building in general, what it takes to keep the lights, the water, the electricity on, and then and all the staff that go in and out every day, and then you're like, this is all for 15 people. The cost just becomes astronomical. So you can go to the Prison Policy Initiative if you want the broad overview. If you're interested in specific states, you can go to, whatever the state is, plus Department of Corrections, and look up their annual reports. Sometimes they give a breakdown of budgets, quarterly, depending on which state. And then if you're looking for a county, you can go to that county's website and look for, how much are they spending, on their county jail per year.
Okay. Someone asked, what is happening in Norway that is so revolutionary? Because if someone hadn't read this book and I mentioned Norway, why can't we just make our prisons like Norway? Some folks might want to know what is it about Norway? Can you go a little bit into that detail?
Yeah, sure. So Norway has this very interesting model of what they call open prisons, where they're more like college campuses, or
Now these aren't all their prisons, right?
This is not all their prisons.
Okay.
They have some prisons that are open prisons, and these are the ones that everybody points to. Then they have prisons that are more like prisons, and nobody points to those prisons as potential models. But in these open prisons, people can go and they live in what kind of looks like, college campuses. They have their own rooms, they're able to, like have their own movement. They can participate in college classes. They can do other programs. They're allowed to leave the prison, and like go see their family, go work, and then they come back. So it's kind of like, being on a college campus with a curfew type of thing. And Norway has a very small population compared to the United States, period. Norway has a very small prison population compared to the United States. At one point,
Norway, theirs is even smaller percentage-wise of their whole than ours is of our whole. Like it's smaller percentage.
Yeah. I mean, the United States, incarcerates 698 of every 100,000 people. Norway incarcerates like, a handful of people per every 100,000 people. So they can have these prisons because they have so few people, but they're vastly expensive. So for the person who asked how much does it cost per person, how much does it cost to incarcerate per person? Let me actually find the number that it costs to incarcerate people in Norway. And it is, so the yearly spending for one of their open prisons comes out to $93,000 per person.
Yeah, I remember reading it was 90.
So, so if you think about that, the cost is astronomical, but what they're doing is they're investing in people as if they are going to be, and they know that they are going to come home and be, family members, community members, people's neighbors. But you also have to remember that Norway is a country that, again, is much smaller than ours, that has a very robust social service system outside of prison. So you don't have as many people going into prison in the first place. And again, they treat them as if they're going to come home. And, they say, well, do we want them to come home worse? And for, folks who have been in jail, been in prison, or have worked, with other people who've been in jail or prison, they know that it's really challenging to come home. You come home and it's like you have like a scarlet, like P on your head for prison, and people don't want to hire you. They don't want to rent to you. You don't have any sort of, rental history or credit history to be able to, do all of the things that people who have not been in prison are more able to do. So in Norway, they treat people as if they're going to come home from day one. It's like, okay, we know you're going to come home, even if you, are here for 20 years for murder, you are still going to come home at some point. Yeah. So I think that what we should take away from Norway is not, we should build these gigantically expensive prisons for $93,000 per person, to incarcerate a person, but we should treat people in prison as if they're community members and family members and loved ones who are going to come home at some point. And then we should also say, what are the things that we need to keep people out of prison to begin with? What are the things that Norway has that we don't have that, allow them to keep people out of prison?
Yeah, I think in my mind, there's kind of the 3 steps we could look at. Like on the front end, what could we do to help youth and people in the community? Then what could we do in prison? Like you said, there's certain prisons where people can take college classes, but then that's not the same across the board. And then on the back end, especially with the folks I work with, what could we do to help them not have that scarlet letter or not have that hanging over their heads? Because that's one of the biggest issues is recidivism, because it's so hard to just get going once you get out of prison or jail to like get a life that's worth, that you can build anything upon. I mean, even looking at the sex registry, because I have children and I have
Mm-hmm.
strong feelings about people on the sex registry. But
Mm-hmm.
then I also understand that, like you say, there might have been like they were both there was the girl was underage, but the boy was 18. So then he
Mm-hmm.
got like charged with something and she was 16, but it was a Romeo and Juliet situation. Or someone, they did something heinous or maybe had child pornography or whatever, but afterward, if they could show over a course of a certain number of years that they are reformed and haven't strayed back into that, like, can they get off the sex registry? Could we make it so that people can be redeemed and get stuff off their record and make it easier for them to get back their right to vote, once they've
Mm-hmm.
completed. I don't know. I feel like there's so many things we could do, like you say, in all three kind of sections, the before
Mm-hmm.
prison, the in prison, and the after prison, to
Yeah.
kind of help get folks being back to being productive members
Mm-hmm.
of society.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that one of the things about the sex offender registry is that it gives us this false sense of security that like we know who the bad guys are. But in reality, like, 93% of child sexual abuse is not by the stranger in the van, or the stranger, on the sex offender registry, but it's by family members or trusted community members, people close to the family or
Mm.
acquaintances. And children often don't report, or when they do, they're not believed because it's like, oh, well, that couldn't be, because that's the little league coach, like everybody
Yeah.
loves him, are you sure you didn't imagine it? Or, like that's your uncle, like, are you sure you didn't imagine it?
Yeah. You don't
And
want Uncle Joe to go to prison, do you? Like,
exactly. And so, it means that, only 10 to 18 of every 100 incidents of child sexual abuse gets reported to authorities. And that, is traumatizing for a child to have to sit there and recount over and over and over this terrible thing that happens. And
hmm
from there, the numbers get smaller. Like only 6 go to trial, only 3 get convicted of something. They might not even end up on the registry, but
hmm
this registry gives us the sense that like, oh, we know who the bad guys are. Instead of saying, you know, your body is your body, right? Nobody should be touching you when you don't want them to touch
hmm
you, but also understanding that people, like we should be able to recognize signs when things aren't right, like when we're like, oh, that person is, like, beloved little league coach also like sometimes gets a little weird and maybe we should like, like keep an eye out on him, or
Yeah.
maybe we should talk to him, be like, hey, that is not okay. What are you doing?
hmm
So it gives us this idea that people who abuse children are these monsters and we can spot them. They're going to have horns and they're going to have like a big, SO on their foreheads. And, nobody in our community, in our church, in our, like in our schools or anybody else would be doing those, as
hmm
opposed to thinking like, like we need to be aware, give kids the skills to be able to say like no and believe them when they, and reinforce this idea that like, no, even though Uncle John wants you to kiss him all the time, you don't have to if you don't want to,
Yeah.
like that's okay. Be like, no, like let's just settle for like a handshake or a fist bump or whatever, like, and give children that kind of autonomy over their bodies.
So we'll wrap it up here. The final question, looking forward, what is a book that are you working on a book right now, or do you have something in the works for the future?
I may have a book, like in the future. I've been working on it, so I'm gonna like kind of keep it under wraps. So I'll talk
Okay.
about some of the things that I've done in this past like COVID year, which is focusing very much on the pandemic in prison, jails and prisons. I
hmm
mean, just as we were all hit very hard outside, people in jails and prisons cannot socially distance. Like if you're in a dormitory, you're often like a couple of feet away from the next person and people have to breathe. Like if you are in a cell, oftentimes you're in a cell with like 1, 2, sometimes even 13 other people, depending on
Mm.
which prison you're in. And it's impossible to socially distance. You still have, like staff members coming in and out, so every time there's a shift change, there's a new potential for the virus to come in, and it is exploded behind bars,
Mm.
often with, terrible and tragic consequences. So that was like some of the reporting I did over the past year, was just really, kind of heartbreaking sometimes to like hear stories about that. But then we also saw that some places started saying like, well, we should not be incarcerating people for these like low level offenses. We should not be, locking up people right now in these very crowded conditions because they might catch COVID. So, I mean, so it was also like a hopeful note that didn't go far enough in terms of like saying like, now we're at this point where we can decarcerate and we can see that, chaos and violence and anarchy didn't happen because of this, like maybe we can keep it that way.
Okay. Before I let Denise take over, did cast members sign your Wicked poster back there?
Yes.
Were those original cast members, or was this like more recently?
So. I think it was more recently.
Okay. No one mourns the wicked. I like that musical. I was a big fan of it.
It's a beautiful musical. I love it.
Well, thank you, ladies, very much. And I guess the book I was referring to but stumbled over, I'm sorry, that she co-authored was Prisons by Any Other Name. To correct that. I thank you all for being with us tonight. Again, the book is Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. Yes. Thank you, Ms. Victoria, for coming to us from New York City. And thank you, Rachel, for the work you do here in Gwinnett County and all of us in Gwinnett. Thank you for coming and have a lovely evening.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for the work that you all do, at the library with Reentry and everything.